It often makes me reflect on whether a particular celestial draw singles out specific individuals for the role of HOA president. I'm not referring to the benevolent type, understand, the sort who genuinely strives to preserve an agreeable neighborhood. No, my focus is on those who appear to regard the position as an enthronement, converting their residential loop into a private dominion. I believe I may have set a global benchmark for the most outrageous directive ever issued by such a figurehead. Have you ever been given a 2-day ultimatum to demolish a considerable section of your multi-million-dollar lakeside residence, a dwelling you had meticulously conceived and invested years of your life in? Or, to quote directly, vacate the premises? And all this to enable the HOA to establish a small public walkway to the lake, traversing my living area. Yes, that actually occurred. Stay tuned because this account is not merely outlandish. It's an exemplary illustration of the collision between unbridled entitlement and steadfast legal truth. You will scarcely credit the levels of preposterousness we are about to uncover. My residence, Serenity Point, represented more than a mere dwelling. It was the apex of a long-held aspiration situated on a choice piece of lakeside real estate that had been held by my family for many years. My grandfather, an astute individual with a fondness for the terrain, had secured a considerable tract back when this vicinity was largely wild forest and glistening water. I received it with a profound sense of responsibility. And after a career in the exacting sphere of corporate finance, focusing specifically on intricate asset management and enduring commercial leases, I was at last prepared to construct my haven. The residence itself was contemporary, spacious, conceived to harmonize with the surroundings, featuring vast glass expanses that provided sweeping lake vistas. It offered privacy, seclusion, and precisely met my desires. The closest development, a cluster of rather homogeneous beige-clad dwellings identifying itself as Lakeside Harmony Estates, was situated a good quarter-mile distant. Divided by a dense grove of established trees I had made certain remained undisturbed. I was scarcely aware of their presence, and truth be told, that contributed to its attractiveness. Subsequently, Brenda entered the picture, or more precisely, an official-appearing letterhead from the Lakeside Harmony Estates Homeowners Association arrived, bearing the signature of a certain Brenda Milligan, president. The initial communication was harmless enough. A courteous, albeit slightly overbearing, message concerning the assurance that my construction remnants, which had vanished long ago, by the way, as the house had been finished for close to a year, were not diminishing the neighborhood's visual appeal. I dispatched a similarly civil, though possibly a touch more reserved, reply confirming all building work was concluded and my estate was pristine, accompanied by photographic proof. I assumed the matter was settled. How mistaken I proved to be. Brenda, it transpired, was not an individual readily dissuaded by factual information or, as events would show, by legal principles. She was, from what I later gleaned from subdued murmurs and tired looks from other inhabitants I sometimes encountered on the main thoroughfare, a veritable phenomenon clad in a polyester pantsuit. She operated a pearly white SUV, the type slightly oversized for residential streets, consistently sported sunglasses concealing half her visage, and owned a voice I envisioned capable of souring milk from 50 paces away. Her distinctive style of command appeared to originate from an unshakable conviction in her own significance, a conviction seemingly echoed by her board, a compact assembly of similarly conceited persons. The intensification commenced discreetly, then swiftly gathered speed, resembling an uncontrolled lawnmower veering towards a prized petunia bed. Whispers were conveyed to me by an anxious-appearing handyman engaged for some standard upkeep concerning a novel community project spearheaded by President Brenda. This undertaking, veiled in ambiguous language such as improving common facilities and advancing lake accessibility for all inhabitants, had a foreboding ring. My estate, you understand, possessed the most straightforward and scenic route to the lake. Lakeside Harmony Estates, its name notwithstanding, was situated away from the waterfront with merely a diminutive swampy portion of shared ground at a distant extremity that was mostly impractical. My handyman, a local fellow named Gary who had witnessed numerous HOA capers, cautioned me. "I hear Brenda is targeting your section of lakeshore, Mr. Davies," he said. "Claims it isn't equitable for one individual to possess all that prime access." I expressed my gratitude, a chilling apprehension constricting in my gut. The sheer nerve was astounding. Subsequently, the formal communication materialized. Delivered by certified mail, naturally, as nothing conveys we are serious, quite like a visit to the postal service, and an additional $5 for a signed receipt. The message, typed on the identical pretentious letterhead, was a paragon of passively aggressive self-righteousness. It mentioned a recent HOA board ballot, a unanimous resolution, of course, to construct a communal path and scenic overlook along the lakeshore. And, as fate would have it, the ideal course for this pathway, as per their internally produced feasibility assessment, which I surmised was sketched on Brenda's dining table using a ruler and a crayon, traversed directly across my landscaped grounds, requiring the dismantling of a substantial segment of my privacy barrier and, if I interpreted the rudimentary map accurately, the edge of my guest annex. The communication concluded with a final demand. I was given 48 hours to either furnish written approval for this small easement and consent to a demolition timeline for the hindering structures or, and this was the clincher, face proceedings to vacate the premises owing to non-compliance with overriding community development covenants established for the welfare of all Lakeside Harmony Estates homeowners. In essence, they were attempting to expel me from my own multi-million-dollar residence situated on land possessed by my family for nearly 100 years. The absolute, unmitigated effrontery of it rendered me briefly speechless. Then a distinct sentiment began to surface, not merely rage, but a cool, methodical determination. They coveted my land and my dwelling. They sought to impose conditions on an estate to which they held no legitimate entitlement whatsoever. President Brenda and her meddlesome associates had just disturbed a hornet's nest. However, they evidently did not realize that the hornets in this specific nest were equipped with many years of expertise in contract law and an almost ingrained detestation of intimidators. My first surprise transformed into a somber kind of diversion. This was poised to be captivating. They genuinely had no comprehension of the individual they were confronting. The 48-hour ultimatum was, naturally, ludicrously preposterous. It constituted no valid legal period for anything more significant than perhaps taking back a library volume or ruining a late-evening food order. My initial impulse, the purely visceral one, was to stride to Brenda Milligan's nondescript beige dwelling and deliver a scathing discourse on property entitlements, basic reason, and the utter audacity of her directive. However, my vocational conditioning, refined through years of managing intricate discussions and aggressive acquisitions in the finance sector, took precedence. Allowing sentiment was an indulgence I could not permit myself. A strategic approach was essential. The initial person I contacted was Arthur Jenkins, my legal counsel. Arthur, a semi-retired specialist in real estate litigation, possessed a keen intellect and a composure so profound it could pacify an enraged beast. He attended with forbearance as I detailed the letter's contents, his only audible reaction being an intermittent, contemplative hum. Upon my conclusion, a brief silence ensued. "Well, Marcus," he remarked, his tone as crisp as a well-made martini, "it seems your neighbors harbor aspirations considerably beyond their lawful authority or, perhaps, their cognitive capacity. We need a copy of that communication and their purported feasibility study, along with any records you possess concerning the Lakeside Harmony Estates HOA. Fortunately, I am an exacting keeper of records, a trait inherited from my grandfather. Each title document, every surveyor's plan, and all correspondence pertaining to Serenity Point and the adjacent lands was preserved both in physical and digital formats. While Arthur commenced his preliminary investigation into the HOA legislation pertinent to our state, I immersed myself in my family's comprehensive archives. The Lakeside Harmony Estates development, I was aware, was fairly new, constructed in the latter part of the 1990s. My grandfather had granted a lease for a substantial portion of his property, the section situated behind the future site of my Serenity Point, to a firm named Prestige Community Developers Incorporated. This was an enduring ground lease, a frequent arrangement whereby the developer erects and oversees structures on land not owned by them, remitting payment to the landowner. The separate dwellings within Lakeside Harmony Estates were then, one would assume, sold or leased by Prestige to their present inhabitants. The pivotal inquiry was, what were the terms of those contracts? And, of greater significance, what provisions were set forth in the master lease between my family and Prestige Community Developers? Obtaining the HOA's foundational paperwork and internal regulations presented the initial small obstacle. A courteous email inquiry sent to the general HOA email, likely overseen by Brenda herself or her assistant, a timid-looking woman named Carol whom I had once encountered at the local supermarket, initially received no response. A subsequent, somewhat more emphatic, message elicited a terse answer asserting that such records were accessible to homeowners in good standing and that I should refer to my introductory materials. Given that I was not a member of their association, This was evidently an attempt to dismiss me. Arthur, however, employed more straightforward tactics. A strongly phrased letter from his legal practice to the HOA's official representative, referencing state laws concerning access to HOA information for interested parties, and I was undeniably an interested party, achieved the desired result. A substantial manila envelope appeared a few days thereafter, enclosing the Articles of Incorporation for the Lakeside Harmony Estates Homeowners Association, their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, and their prevailing bylaws. I laid out the papers across my expansive study desk, the aroma of aged documents and formal ink permeating the atmosphere. Arthur came, and we dedicated the majority of a day to scrutinizing the convoluted legal language. It was within the detailed stipulations of the initial master lease agreement between my grandfather and Prestige Community Developers Incorporated that we found our breakthrough. More accurately, I made the discovery as I remembered a particular collection of provisions my grandfather had mandated, clauses I had examined some years prior when I first assumed oversight of the family's property holdings. He had been a man of foresight, predicting possible future disagreements with a lucidity that now appeared almost divinatory. The master lease, a document spanning almost 100 pages, was exceptionally robust. It specified precisely what Prestige was permitted and prohibited from doing on the property. It stipulated that any association established by inhabitants of the development would be subordinate to the conditions of this master lease. And then came the crucial part, Clause 37B, subsection 2. The lessee, Prestige Community Developers Incorporated, shall be accountable for guaranteeing that all sublessees, tenants, and their associations behave in a way that does not obstruct, vex, or otherwise encroach upon the lessors, that is, myself as heir, tranquil possession of their preserved ancestral properties, including, specifically, the tract identified as Serenity Point. It proceeded to outline corrective measures for violations, encompassing considerable monetary fines, and, in instances of ongoing and unaddressed disturbances, the possible cancellation of the complete master lease. However, the genuine revelation, the one that elicited a rare chuckle from Arthur, was discovered not within the HOA paperwork but in the county land records, when cross-checked against the master lease. I was already aware that I held outright ownership of Serenity Point. What I had not entirely grasped, or rather, had overlooked in the heat of this particular dispute, was the vastness of the initial tract leased to Prestige. As we correlated the lot identifiers and survey diagrams, the situation became remarkably evident. The ground supporting every single dwelling in Lakeside Harmony Estates, the thoroughfares they used, the minuscule area of communal wetland they hopefully termed their lake access, even the soil beneath Brenda Milligan's beige monument to conventionality, I possessed it entirely. They were, fundamentally, occupants on my property. To be more exact, they were subtenants of Prestige Community Developers, who, in turn, were my principal lessee. This homeowners association, this collective attempting to impose its will upon me and appropriate a section of my private holdings, consisted wholly of tenants who, it appeared, had confused their lease contracts with titles of ownership. The incongruity was so palpable one could almost slice it. President Brenda Milligan and her Lakeside Harmony Estates HOA were not merely pursuing a mistaken course of action. They were pursuing it against a tree that belonged to me, and they were soon to learn that this tree was fiercely protected. Moreover, a brief review of state laws corroborated Arthur's preliminary conjecture. An HOA brandishing the sort of authority Brenda sought to exercise, imposing penalties, requiring property modifications, commencing evictions, ordinarily needed to be an organization of veritable property title holders, not renters. Their whole framework, their very assertion of control over anything more than arranging the yearly covered dish supper, rested on an unstable basis. This was not simply an instance of exceeding their bounds. It was a profound distortion of their lawful position. The revelation that I was, in effect, the proprietor of the whole Lakeside Harmony Estates was a pivotal development. It altered the balance of power from myself against an irritatingly tenacious insect to myself against an insect unwittingly attempting to harm the entity that, figuratively speaking, possessed the very marshland it inhabited. Arthur and I commenced devising a multifaceted plan of action. This concerned more than just halting Brenda's ludicrous attempt at land acquisition. It was about guaranteeing that such folly would not recur. And, to be entirely truthful with myself, A small, dispassionate part of me anticipated instructing President Milligan on the nuances of property legislation and the notion of excessive pride. Initially, we had to confront the lawfulness of the HOA's existence. Arthur felt certain that an organization consisting exclusively of renters or sublessees could not legitimately exercise the legal authorities of a genuine homeowners association, especially concerning the encumbrance of, or making demands upon, the actual fee-simple landowner, namely myself. He started to compose a formal grievance to the state agency charged with supervising HOAs and community associations, detailing the falsehoods and ultra vires conduct of the Lakeside Harmony Estates HOA. This action would, at a minimum, formally apprise them of the issue and trigger an official inquiry into their legal status. In the meantime, the 48-hour limit specified in Brenda's pretentious communication elapsed. I naturally took no action whatsoever to adhere to their demands. I did not tear down my barrier. I did not volunteer my guest annex for their walkway. I did not leave my property. I merely persisted in savoring my morning beverage with a view of the lake, though perhaps with a somewhat more mocking grin than was typical. I pictured Brenda, ensconced in her operational hub, likely her kitchen, surrounded by food containers and brewing animosity, becoming progressively more flustered. Her pearly white SUV was observed proceeding slowly along my property boundary on several occasions, its darkened windows preventing identification of the occupant, although I harbored my own theories. It struck me as a strikingly crude method of observation. On the third day following the ultimatum's expiration, they took action. It was in the late afternoon. I was in my office examining market analyses when I detected a disturbance outdoors. Glancing through the window coverings, I observed Brenda Milligan in person, accompanied by two fairly sizable, menacing-appearing individuals whom I took to be her unrecognized enforcement team. One was endeavoring to attach a luridly orange final notice of violation decal to my stone gatepost, while his companion recorded the event on his mobile phone, a smug expression on his countenance. Brenda was positioned a short distance away, arms folded, orchestrating the scene like a director of a poorly funded movie. This was exactly the sort of unprofessional display I had foreseen. What they were unaware of was that my personal security apparatus, an unobtrusive yet thorough system of high-definition cameras, was documenting their every action, utterance, and self-pleased look. I allowed them to conclude their minor spectacle, then serenely stepped outside, recording with my own phone. "Good afternoon, Ms. Milligan," I stated, my tone steady. "Experiencing difficulty with that decal? Maybe you are unacquainted with the ideas of private ownership and malicious destruction." Brenda stammered, evidently unprepared for a direct challenge. "Mr. Davies, you are in definite breach. This constitutes official HOA activity." The two heavies inflated their chests. I merely grinned. "Official, you claim? That is a most curious understanding. I advise that you and your companions depart from my premises at once before I contact the sheriff to file a complaint for trespassing and attempted defacement." The reference to law enforcement appeared to lessen their bravado somewhat. Following some additional bluster from Brenda concerning repercussions and subsequent measures, they withdrew, directing bitter stares back at me. The orange decal, I observed with a degree of contentment, had not stuck correctly to the stone and was already detaching at the corners, an apt symbol for their whole undertaking. The subsequent action involved communicating with Prestige Community Developers Incorporated, the genuine lessee of the property beneath Lakeside Harmony Estates. Arthur composed a carefully phrased communication. It was not hostile, simply objective. It detailed the harassment I had experienced from their subtenants association, the unlawful directives issued, the attempted intrusion, and included copies of Brenda's letter, pictures of the decal incident, and a civil yet resolute reminder of Clause 37B, subsection 2 of their master lease agreement, the one concerning the obligation to ensure their tenants did not vex me. The message also underscored the possibility of significant monetary sanctions and, critically, intimated that such flagrant contempt for the conditions of the master lease might be deemed a material breach. This provided me with justification for canceling their 50-year lease on the whole development, a prospect I knew would capture their focus. The forfeiture of Lakeside Harmony Estates would represent a disastrous monetary setback for Prestige. While anticipating Prestige's unavoidable alarm, Arthur and I reevaluated the master lease for monetary advantage, particularly concerning the tank's rent scenario that had occurred to me as an appropriate repercussion. Randomly increasing rent is not the typical procedure in such matters. However, my grandfather, with his admirable prudence, had incorporated a highly particular and quite severe provision addressing violations that endangered the tranquil use of his remaining properties or damaged the property's reputation. Clause 42C, liquidated damages for persistent nuisance, stated that if the lessee, Prestige, did not remedy a major violation concerning tenant misbehavior after formal notification, a fine equal to 1 year's normal rent for the whole tract could be instantly imposed. Additionally, it permitted an urgent rent reassessment and modification outside the standard decennial review period if the essential character of the leasehold was endangered by the lessee's inability to oversee its activities or subtenants. Considering the prevailing standard yearly rent for that expansive tract, which was already considerable, an extra full year's amount as a fine, combined with the activation of an instant rent renegotiation under pressure, could readily be depicted as a colossal surge. Maybe not precisely a tenfold increase instantaneously, but undoubtedly a debilitating monetary shock that would cause them significant distress and grant me enormous power to impose new, far more stringent conditions, including a markedly elevated base rent in the future. The development firm, by its carelessness in managing Brenda, had given me the monetary counterpart of a tactical nuclear weapon. The elegance of this situation was that this monetary suffering would unavoidably be transferred from Prestige to the inhabitants of Lakeside Harmony Estates, the very individuals whose HOA had instigated this charade. Their pursuit of my lakeshore was on the verge of becoming exceedingly costly for them. The reaction from Prestige Community Developers Incorporated arrived, as expected, rapidly and in a state of alarm. My attorney, Arthur, got a telephone call within 24 hours of their receipt of our registered mail. Mr. Henderson, a senior executive at Prestige, had the tone of someone who had just witnessed his pension plan vanish. He expressed remorse, dismay, and an urgent desire to convince us of their ignorance regarding Brenda Milligan's unauthorized conduct, and that they would undertake prompt and firm measures to correct matters. He almost implored us to convene. Arthur, with his most composed and evasive tone, consented to an initial conversation but emphasized that time was running out concerning the contractual violation. The onus was now firmly on Prestige to control Brenda and her HOA. I could nearly imagine the desperate telephone communications occurring between Prestige's main office and Brenda's unassuming residence. Brenda, I surmised, was on the verge of experiencing a truly unpleasant day, thanks to her own property lessors. Faithful to Mr. Henderson's alarmed pledge, events began to unfold. I obtained a formally phrased letter of regret, not from Brenda, but from Prestige Community Developers, acting for the Lakeside Harmony Estates Residence Committee. They were already diminishing the HOA designation. It guaranteed me that all communal walkway projects affecting my estate were at once and forever rescinded. It further notified me that Brenda Milligan had been counseled concerning suitable neighborly behavior. Counseled? That was a significant minimization, I felt certain. However, Brenda, true to her nature, was evidently not inclined to surrender without resistance, or at minimum, without a last, ill-judged show of powerless rage. An announcement materialized on the Lakeside Harmony Estates community notice board. A picture of it was quietly forwarded to me by Gary, my handyman, who was thoroughly relishing the developing spectacle, declaring an urgent HOA assembly. The meeting's purpose: pressing deliberation concerning outside meddling in community matters and reassertion of inhabitants' entitlements. She intended to attempt to galvanize her supporters, portraying herself as the aggrieved party and me as the malevolent despot. This, I perceived, was the ideal moment. Arthur and I resolved to be present, not to dispute, not to entreat, but to administer the coup de grace personally before her complete assembly. The urgent assembly took place in the rather cheerless community center, a squat structure with discolored paint and a noticeable scent of old coffee and despair. Arthur and I appeared several minutes after its appointed commencement, orchestrating our arrival for optimal impact. The chamber was crowded, a throng of apprehensive and bitter countenances. Brenda Milligan was positioned at an unstable lectern. In the midst of a tirade, she was attired in an especially loud hue of fuchsia, her voice attaining almost supersonic pitches as she condemned the deceitful strategies of affluent property owners attempting to quash the rightful ambitions of industrious families. She painted of Boza Time and 17 a rock with the 8 Rock 17 variant right comment picture of herself as a brave Joan of Arc fighting for their right to a tiny sliver of my lakeside paradise. A smattering of tentative applause followed. She was palpably attempting to incite them into a fury of virtuous outrage. It was a considerable act. She failed to notice our entry, her back being largely turned towards the doorway. When she eventually halted for air, a board representative, a timid-appearing gentleman named Gerald who perpetually seemed to be excusing his own presence, noticed us. He pulled at Brenda's sleeve, murmuring insistently. Brenda pivoted, her eyes dilating somewhat as she observed me and Arthur positioned tranquilly at the rear of the chamber. A brief expression, was it astonishment? Apprehension, flitted across her features before a resolute scowl took its place. Well, she uttered, her tone laden with sarcasm. See who has chosen to honor us with his company, Mr. Davies. Have you come to clarify why you believe you are superior to everyone else here? The assembly hummed, a quiet rumble of assent emanating from her staunchest allies. I merely offered a slight smile. Arthur advanced. Ms. Milligan, representatives of the Lakeside Harmony Estates Residence Committee, he commenced, his tone composed yet resonant in the abruptly quieted chamber. My client, Mr. Davies, is not present to justify his actions. He is present because there exist several essential realities that you all appear to have disregarded, realities possessing substantial and prompt repercussions for each individual in this assembly. Brenda jeered. Realities? The sole reality here is his attempt to intimidate us. Arthur paid her no heed, turning instead to speak to the gathered inhabitants. The primary reality, he stated, his voice taking on a slightly graver note, is that Mr. Davies is not merely one more inhabitant. He is, in actuality, the fee simple proprietor of all the terrain on which Lakeside Harmony Estates stands. Each dwelling, each street, this very clubhouse, it all rests on land belonging to Mr. Davies' family trust. A communal intake of breath swept the room, expressions shifted from bewildered to astounded. Brenda's jaw visibly fell. That's untrue, she faltered. It is documented in public registries, Ms. Milligan, Arthur proceeded without pause. This leads me to the secondary reality. You are not, in the conventional or lawful meaning, homeowners possessing the entitlements and authorities you have asserted. You are, in truth, subleasees. Your principal lessor is Prestige Community Developers who, in turn, hold the lease for the land from my client. This homeowners association, as you term it, possesses no lawful basis to issue demands to the genuine landowner concerning his personal estate. Your efforts to coerce Mr. Closopes and Svet 18190 Davies into relinquishing his property, your menacing statements, your intrusion, these behaviors are not merely unsuitable, they are unlawful. He halted, allowing this information to be absorbed. The quiet in the chamber was now heavy with emerging dread. Moreover, Arthur continued, his eyes scanning the assembly, your association, by falsely portraying itself and endeavoring to wield authorities it lacks under state legislation. Authorities usually designated for organizations of genuine property owners has probably infringed upon multiple state laws. A formal grievance has already been submitted to the appropriate state agencies to examine these discrepancies. Further gasps ensued. Individuals began to direct their gaze at Brenda, not with backing, but with burgeoning fury and apprehension. Yet, possibly the most pressing reality you must comprehend, Arthur declared, his voice lowering somewhat, thereby generating an even greater sense of concentration, pertains to Prestige Community Developers. Owing to the vexation and attempted encroachment on property arranged by this committee, particularly by Ms. Milligan, Prestige is currently in significant violation of its master lease agreement with Mr. Davies. This violation has activated substantial penalty provisions. He gazed straight at Brenda, who had become pallid and was shaking. To be precise, a liquidated damages fine equal to 1 complete extra year's rent for the whole development tract is now owed and must be paid by Prestige. And, of greater importance to all of you, it has prompted an instant rent reassessment and alteration for the master lease. He allowed that statement to resonate for a moment. Mr. Davies has directed me to notify Prestige that the new, continuous ground rent for the Lakeside Harmony Estates tract as a result of these flagrant violations and Prestige's evident failure to oversee its subtenants will rise very considerably starting with the next payment period. An escalation, I can guarantee you that Prestige Community Developers will be compelled to transfer directly to each and every one of you through markedly increased rents or site charges. The The chamber exploded, not with endorsement for Brenda, but with a discordant clamor of stunned indignation, terror, and accusation, all aimed at their now dishonored president. "You did what?" one person exclaimed. "Our payments are increasing because of your actions," yelled another. Brenda was rendered mute, her fuchsia attire abruptly appearing gaudy and preposterous. She parted her lips, then shut them again, appearing completely vanquished. The monarch had been unseated, not by a competitor, but by the straightforward, irrefutable burden of lawful reality and her own immense presumption. Arthur and I simply remained there, observing the residential breakdown. The spectacle was even more satisfying than I had envisioned. The consequences of that tumultuous assembly were rapid and, for certain individuals, harsh. The Lakeside Harmony Estates Homeowners Association, as an authority-exercising body, vanished virtually instantaneously. The state inquiry that Arthur had set in motion swiftly corroborated its flawed establishment and excessive actions, culminating in an official directive to disband or reorganize into what it should always have been: a tenant social group with no real power beyond arranging cookouts and lodging complaints about animal waste. Brenda Milligan's period of dominance concluded not with a dramatic event, but with the subdued anticlimax of her pearly white SUV being placed onto a removal vehicle some weeks thereafter. It was rumored that Prestige Community Developers, in an urgent attempt to placate me and lessen some of the monetary harm, had firmly intimated that her lease agreement would not be extended. I refrained from probing too deeply. Her exit provided sufficient contentment. The sight of her sunglasses askew, her face a portrayal of baffled rage as she was conveyed from her nondescript fortress for the final time, constituted a silent triumph. For Prestige Community Developers, the monetary consequences were substantial. The punitive provision for an entire year's rent affected them severely, and the revised master lease, although not reaching the tanks figure I had once imagined at a high point of emotion, included a very considerable rise in their yearly ground rent. I was, ultimately, a man of commerce, and though I savored the feeling of success, my main objective was enduring stability and the peaceful possession of my estate. The updated lease incorporated stringent stipulations concerning tenant behavior, supervisory duties for Prestige, and even more severe fines for any subsequent offenses. As Arthur had foreseen, Prestige was compelled to transfer these heightened expenses to the inhabitants of Lakeside Harmony Estates. Their rental payments and site fees experienced a steep, distressing increase. The paradoxical nature of the situation was evident to all. Their group effort, led by Brenda, to obtain complimentary use of my prime lakeside land had led to them disbursing considerably more money to reside at a greater distance from it. With reduced discretionary funds for even contemplating lakeside leisure, some inhabitants, incapable or disinclined to bear the augmented expenses, eventually relocated. The atmosphere of Lakeside Harmony Estates started to transform, possibly becoming somewhat more subdued, somewhat more modest. Several of the more sensible inhabitants, those who had been privately uneasy with Brenda's campaign but too cowed to voice their concerns, contacted me separately in the subsequent months. They extended regrets, conveyed their mortification regarding the entire episode, and made hesitant proposals for a more amicable coexistence. I received their apologies with courtesy. I held no grievance against individuals who comprehended limits and honored property entitlements. In a display of, one might term it, deliberate generosity, and also because a peaceful, albeit remote, association with the development was more desirable than continuous hostility, I ultimately directed Arthur to negotiate a highly restricted, rigorously supervised access arrangement with Prestige. Not a public right-of-way, by no means, but a gate operated by keycard at the distant edge of their current, rather rundown communal space, providing entry to a small, demarcated portion of lakeshore situated a considerable distance from Serenity Point. This would be overseen and kept up by Prestige, with explicit regulations and duties. It incurred some additional expense for them to establish and preserve, yet it afforded the remaining inhabitants the lakeside entry they desired, though completely under my conditions, and it solidified my definitive control over the property. It was a minor cost for them to bear in exchange for tranquility and a valuable lesson. Contemplating the entire preposterous affair, I was impressed by the unmitigated nerve stemming from a sense of privilege. Brenda Milligan sincerely thought she possessed the prerogative to interfere with my existence, diminish the worth of my estate, and, in essence, seize a portion of my family's historic land for her insignificant concept of a neighborhood. She, along with her unthinking adherents, functioned under the misconception that their wishes took precedence over my entitlements. It served as a sharp prompt that occasionally the most formidable intimidators are not located in executive suites or global forums but in the immediate vicinity, equipped with merely an unjustified feeling of self-importance and an inadequately comprehended collection of regulations. The pressure had been significant indeed, yet the gratification derived from observing their whole structure of conceit disintegrate beneath the burden of carefully investigated information and skillfully implemented legal tactics was profound. It represented a triumph not solely for myself but for any individual who has ever contended with an overly enthusiastic HOA or a neighbor who believes community translates to "you provide what I desire." The fundamental teaching, one my grandfather had evidently grasped, was the paramount significance of being aware of one's rights, comprehending one's agreements, and never, ever misjudging an adversary while also ensuring they do not misjudge you. And so concludes the account of how I found myself in the unexpected position of effectively holding title to the land beneath an entire homeowners association, a situation that culminated in my delivery of a rather costly, albeit well-deserved, tutorial on property law and the importance of humility. Indeed, it becomes quite clear that the role of landlord is not without its unique advantages, particularly when those leasing the property exhibit an unwarranted degree of presumptuousness, forgetting the fundamental basis of their occupancy. Such episodes serve as a potent illustration of how unchecked arrogance can lead to a rather spectacular and financially painful collision with reality.